Evening settles without urgency now. The familiar lowering of the light still reaches across rows of brick houses and narrow streets, but nothing answers it from the sky except drifting clouds whose shapes change slowly in the cooling air. A bicycle rolls across broken cobblestones, its tires finding careful paths between loose fragments of masonry that have remained where they fell days before. Somewhere beyond the nearest corner, a hammer strikes timber with patient regularity. The sound carries farther than it once could have, no longer interrupted by the rising howl that had taught entire neighborhoods to stop whatever they were doing and look upward before they dared to think. So, before we continue walking these quiet streets together, if you find calm reflection and thoughtful history meaningful, take a moment to subscribe, but only if stories told in whispers are your kind of thing. And let us know where you're listening from, or which moment stays with you the most. Your quiet support helps these stories continue to find listeners who are willing to slow down and remember. You're listening to Echoes of War. You find yourself standing at the edge of an ordinary London street, though ordinary has become a difficult word to define. One side remains almost untouched. Curtains hang inside front windows, flower boxes still rest beneath sills, and soot darkens brickwork in ways that belong to years before the war reached overhead. Across from them, entire houses have dissolved into uneven piles of timber, plaster, twisted pipes, and broken staircases leading nowhere except into open air. Between both sides of the road, people continue walking with a practiced caution that has become almost invisible to themselves. They step around rubble without lowering their eyes. Their movements suggest not confidence but familiarity, as though destruction has quietly entered the geography of everyday life. The silence feels different because it is no longer interrupted by expectation. During the months when bombers crossed the night skies, silence had often been only a brief pause before another engine, another siren, another distant concussion. Now it lingers longer than anyone quite remembers. It asks new questions. How do people measure safety after they have learned never to trust the quiet? How does a city begin listening to itself again when its ears have spent years searching the darkness above? For millions of civilians, the end of a bombing raid did not mark the end of hardship. The fires eventually burned themselves out. Rescue crews gradually returned to their stations. Barrage balloons disappeared from familiar skylines. Yet the work that remained could not be measured in hours or even months. It settled into routines so gradual that they were almost impossible to notice while living through them. Entire districts would spend years learning the difference between surviving destruction and living after it. The air itself seems changed. Coal smoke still drifts from chimneys that remain standing, carrying the familiar scent of domestic fires into streets where roofs have vanished. Damp mortar releases an earthy smell after afternoon rain. Fresh-cut timber waits beside damaged buildings where carpenters have begun replacing beams that older craftsmen once fitted generations earlier. Every scent belongs simultaneously to ending and beginning. Nothing feels entirely finished. Nothing feels entirely new. Nearby, two women pause beside a gap in a terrace where several homes once stood shoulder to shoulder. They do not linger out of curiosity. They simply adjust the parcels they are carrying before continuing toward the market farther along the road. Their route has altered many times over recent years as streets disappeared, reopened, and changed again beneath the slow work of clearing debris. Even the simplest journey now contains quiet memories of places that no longer exist. The war is often remembered through the violence that shattered these neighborhoods, through searchlights crossing the clouds, the thunder of collapsing walls, and the courage demanded during endless nights beneath falling bombs. Yet those nights occupied only part of the story. When the bombing stopped, another chapter began almost unnoticed. It unfolded not beneath explosions but beneath ordinary daylight. It asked different forms of endurance. Instead of running toward shelters, people learned how to remain inside streets permanently altered by absence. Instead of waiting for rescue, they began the slower work of rebuilding habits, homes, institutions, and confidence itself. This is where our journey begins, not at the height of destruction, but in the unfamiliar stillness that followed it, where the silence carried its own weight, and where the greatest labor was often invisible to anyone passing by. Morning arrives without ceremony. A pale wash of light spreads across rooftops that no longer form continuous lines, slipping through empty upper floors where bedrooms once overlooked the street. Rainwater has collected overnight inside open foundations, reflecting fragments of sky between broken bricks and bent lengths of iron. Pigeons descend onto shattered chimney stacks with the same indifference they showed before the war, while sparrows disappear into cracks where walls have split apart but still manage to shelter small nests from the wind. Nature rarely pauses to acknowledge human catastrophe. It simply discovers new surfaces upon which to continue its quiet routines. You watch the city awaken one careful movement at a time. Milk carts continue their rounds where roads remain passable. Shopkeepers raise shutters over storefronts that survived, while only a few doors away another family sorts through belongings spread across blankets beside a collapsed house. Neither scene appears unusual anymore. They exist together, almost comfortably, sharing the same stretch of pavement. Recovery rarely begins with dramatic announcements. More often, it arrives disguised as repetition. A window is cleaned. A kettle boils. A newspaper appears outside a front door that no longer opens into the home it once served. For those who remained throughout the bombing, memory does not separate neatly into before and after. The city itself refuses such simplicity. A familiar church tower still rises above the surrounding streets, yet half the buildings that once oriented themselves toward it have vanished. Children learn directions by referring to bomb sites instead of corner shops. Adults give instructions using landmarks that disappeared months ago, catching themselves halfway through a sentence before choosing another point of reference. Geography becomes an act of remembering as much as navigating. Many visitors arriving after the worst raids expected to encounter only devastation. They certainly found it. Across London and other British cities, entire districts bore the marks of sustained aerial bombardment. Warehouses remained roofless long after fires had been extinguished. Railway lines twisted through neighborhoods where stations stood blackened by smoke. Churches, schools, libraries, hospitals, factories, and rows of modest homes all carried different versions of the same interruption. Yet visitors often noticed something else alongside the damage. They encountered queues forming outside bakeries. They saw buses finding improvised routes around blocked streets. Laundry fluttered from surviving windows. Gardens, neglected during the hardest months, began producing flowers once again. Daily life did not wait for reconstruction to finish. It quietly resumed while reconstruction was still struggling to begin. The work ahead proved difficult partly because destruction was uneven. One family might return to a house requiring little more than fresh glass and repaired roof tiles. Their neighbors could return to nothing at all. Entire streets presented bewildering patterns in which untouched buildings stood beside empty plots cleared only of the most dangerous debris. This unevenness shaped every conversation about fairness, housing, insurance, rebuilding priorities, and the countless practical decisions that filled the years after the bombing. Recovery would never unfold as a single coordinated effort moving at the same pace everywhere. It would proceed one street, one family, one repaired wall at a time. Even the sounds of the city reveal this uneven rhythm. Construction hammers echo beside streets where no rebuilding has yet begun. Horse-drawn carts still deliver supplies alongside increasing numbers of motor lorries carrying bricks reclaimed from demolished structures. Church bells ring again where towers remain intact, while nearby congregations gather in temporary halls because their own sanctuaries have disappeared. The familiar music of urban life returns slowly, but each sound carries subtle reminders of what has changed. Nothing is entirely restored. Everything exists somewhere between memory and renewal. As the months pass, people begin speaking less often about surviving individual raids and more often about finding somewhere to live before winter, repairing water pipes, reopening schools, replacing lost furniture, or locating relatives whose wartime movements scattered families across Britain. These conversations lack the dramatic urgency that history often prefers, yet they reveal another form of endurance. They belong to people whose courage is measured not in singular moments but in repetition, returning every morning to problems that cannot be solved in a day, accepting that progress may consist of one repaired staircase, one reopened classroom, or one familiar room made habitable again. Our path through this documentary will remain with those ordinary rhythms. Rather than following the explosions that captured headlines, we will linger beside the quieter labor that followed them. We will return repeatedly to the same neighborhoods as seasons change, observing how damaged streets gradually acquire new routines, how institutions struggle to rebuild what war has broken, and how memory settles into the bricks, parks, railway stations, and homes that continue carrying the weight of absence long after the smoke has cleared. Beneath the dust that remained. The first days after the bombing had a peculiar quality that many later struggled to describe. The danger had not vanished simply because the aircraft had gone. Instead, it seemed to linger invisibly among the buildings themselves. Walls leaned at uncertain angles without announcing whether they intended to stand for another hour or collapse beneath the next strong gust of wind. Floors hung suspended over empty rooms, held together by beams that had already survived more than they were ever designed to bear. Chimneys remained upright despite having lost the houses that once supported them, appearing almost dignified against the pale morning sky while quietly threatening anyone who walked beneath their shadows. A street could look peaceful from a distance and remain profoundly unsafe for those who knew where to place each careful step. You observe people moving through these spaces with remarkable restraint. No one hurries unless necessity demands it. Their eyes travel almost constantly, not searching the sky as they had during the raids, but examining the ground, the walls, the loose stones above doorways, the fragments of roofing balanced where gravity has not yet completed its work. Survival has become less dramatic than it was during the bombing, yet no less attentive. Every ordinary errand now requires a patient conversation with the landscape itself. The destruction reveals the hidden anatomy of domestic life. Entire houses stand opened as though carefully cut apart, exposing staircases ending in open air, wallpaper still clinging to bedroom walls without the rooms they once enclosed, fireplaces suspended several stories above the pavement, cupboards whose shelves continue holding cups and plates while the surrounding structure has disappeared. Private lives become visible not through choice but through absence. Passers-by glimpse dining tables still set beneath collapsed ceilings, children's toys resting where bedrooms once stood, framed photographs somehow remaining upright on fragments of mantelpieces that no longer belong to complete homes. Those scenes produce surprisingly little spectacle among the residents themselves. There is sadness, certainly, but there is also familiarity. Weeks and months of repeated bombing have changed the way destruction is encountered. Neighbors no longer gather simply to stare. They pause, assess whether anyone requires assistance, exchange quiet observations about which streets remain open, then continue with whatever task has brought them outside. Catastrophe has gradually surrendered its ability to astonish. It has become another condition requiring practical response rather than emotional display. Throughout London, and in many other British cities struck by sustained bombing, local authorities begin confronting problems whose scale refuses simple solutions. Clearing debris demands workers, machinery, transport, and careful planning. Yet the debris itself cannot simply disappear. Bricks that remain usable are stacked for future rebuilding. Timber is sorted according to whether it can safely serve another purpose. Twisted metal is collected wherever possible. Even in destruction, materials retain value. The city begins quietly salvaging pieces of itself. The process unfolds with extraordinary patience. Men equipped with shovels, picks, wheelbarrows, ropes, and handcarts work through piles that seem almost impossible to reduce. Mechanical excavators exist, but they cannot reach every narrow street or unstable courtyard. Much of the labor depends upon human judgment and steady physical effort. One stone is lifted. Another is examined. A beam is carefully lowered before someone beneath begins clearing the space it had occupied. Progress rarely announces itself. At the close of an entire day's work, the visible change may consist only of a single doorway becoming accessible once more. You notice how quickly new routines emerge around these work sites. Pedestrians naturally adjust their routes to avoid unstable buildings. Delivery drivers learn which streets remain blocked and which have reopened. Shopkeepers sweep fresh dust from their entrances every morning, knowing more will arrive before evening. Children, despite repeated warnings, remain fascinated by the strange geography surrounding them, treating gaps between buildings with a curiosity that adults cannot entirely discourage because they remember possessing the same instinct before experience taught greater caution. Dust becomes one of the city's most constant companions. It settles upon coats hanging near front doors, drifts through cracked windows, gathers across bookshelves in houses that survived untouched, and returns again after every cartload of rubble passes along the streets. It carries traces of plaster, mortar, brick, soot, ash, and powdered stone so thoroughly mixed together that individual origins no longer matter. Residents wipe tables before preparing meals, shake blankets before sleeping, clean windows whose glass has only recently been replaced, and discover the same fine layer again by afternoon. The bombing has ceased, yet its smallest fragments continue circulating quietly through everyday life. Even silence behaves differently among damaged neighborhoods. Sounds travel farther where walls no longer interrupt them. A hammer striking timber several streets away reaches ears that previously would never have noticed it. Church bells echo through unexpected openings created by missing buildings. Voices carry across empty plots where entire rows of houses once absorbed conversation before it wandered beyond the nearest corner. The city has acquired new acoustics without intending to. Every absence subtly reshapes the way people hear one another. As daylight lengthens toward afternoon, more residents emerge carrying practical intentions rather than sentimental ones. A woman arrives with a bucket and brush to clean the front steps of a house whose upper floor no longer exists. An elderly man carefully oils the hinges of a surviving garden gate, although the fence beside it has collapsed. Nearby, someone hangs washing between two posts overlooking a bomb site because they remain the only suitable place left for drying clothes. None of these actions erase destruction. They simply refuse to surrender ordinary habits to it. Recovery, in its earliest form, does not resemble rebuilding. It resembles persistence quietly repeating itself against a landscape that has forgotten how normal once appeared. As the first afternoons settle into evening, another rhythm begins revealing itself beneath the visible labor. The city does not simply need to clear what has fallen. It must first decide what remains safe enough to approach. Before a single family can recover belongings, before builders can measure foundations, before streets can fully reopen, Countless quiet inspections take place among walls that seem almost unwilling to reveal whether they intend to remain standing. Men wearing hard hats far simpler than those used today move deliberately through damaged terraces, pausing often to examine cracked brickwork, leaning close to timber joints, or gently pressing against walls whose stability cannot be judged from appearance alone. Their work rarely attracts attention, yet every later stage of recovery depends upon these cautious decisions. You watch them from the opposite pavement, where waiting itself becomes part of the landscape. Residents stand outside cordoned streets with remarkable patience, understanding that haste offers little comfort if an overlooked fracture sends another building collapsing into the road. There are no dramatic announcements when a structure is declared safe enough to enter. More often, a barrier is quietly lifted, a brief conversation takes place between an official and a family, and ordinary people walk back toward what remains of their lives carrying little more than empty bags and measured hope. For many households, those first returns become exercises in recognizing familiar places that no longer behave as memory insists they should. A front door may still open exactly as it always has, its hinges producing the same soft creak heard every evening before supper, yet beyond it the hallway now receives daylight from a missing roof. Rain has settled across wooden floors where carpets once muffled footsteps. Wallpaper curls gently away from damp plaster. Clocks have stopped at the hour their walls shook violently enough to throw them from their hooks. Every room contains small negotiations between what survives and what has quietly disappeared. The search for possessions unfolds without urgency because urgency serves little purpose now. Drawers are opened one at a time. Cabinets are emptied carefully lest shifting weight disturb weakened floors. Letters are gathered into bundles before dust has another opportunity to scatter them. Family photographs receive almost instinctive attention, wiped gently with sleeves before being wrapped in newspapers or tucked inside coat pockets. Practical objects matter deeply: blankets, cooking pots, winter clothing, but so too do things whose value cannot be measured through usefulness alone. A child's school certificate, a wedding Bible, an old pocket watch inherited decades earlier, a handful of handwritten recipes folded inside a kitchen drawer. Such items carry continuity at a moment when buildings themselves can no longer provide it. Outside, municipal lorries continue arriving throughout the day, though their progress remains slow. Streets narrowed by fallen masonry cannot accommodate large vehicles easily, and drivers often reverse patiently through spaces that seem scarcely wider than the vehicles themselves. Work crews communicate with brief gestures rather than raised voices, conserving energy for labor that stretches from morning until fading light. The soundscape becomes increasingly familiar: engines idling gently, shovels scraping stone, boots shifting loose bricks, the occasional crack of timber finally surrendering beneath controlled demolition. None of these sounds possess the violence of bombing, yet together they announce another campaign, quieter but no less demanding. Dust continues accompanying every movement, although people begin adapting to it almost unconsciously. Shopkeepers keep cloths within easy reach, wiping counters several times each day without complaint. Housewives shake curtains more frequently than before the war, knowing that fine grey powder finds every opening however tightly windows are closed. Children return from brief excursions with shoes coated in pale residue that mothers scarcely bother mentioning anymore. The city gradually stops treating dust as an intrusion and begins accepting it as another feature of daily weather, as ordinary as rain or winter fog. Certain places remain untouched for reasons not immediately visible. Sections of pavement stay fenced off while specialists examine unexploded bombs buried beneath collapsed buildings or lodged silently below nearby roads. Entire neighborhoods learn to walk around these invisible dangers with disciplined respect. They know that beneath familiar streets lie reminders that the bombing has not fully ended simply because aircraft no longer cross the sky. Sometimes work halts for several hours while engineers proceed with careful deliberation. Conversations continue in lowered voices nearby, shop doors remain open where possible, and residents wait once more, discovering that recovery often advances according to hazards hidden beneath the surface rather than the destruction everyone can plainly see. As evening returns, windows begin glowing wherever electricity has already been restored. The light appears uneven across the city, scattered rather than continuous. One house shines warmly while its neighboring plot remains an empty darkness open to the stars. A row of intact shops forms a welcoming ribbon beneath street lamps, only to end abruptly where shattered buildings interrupt both commerce and illumination. Seen from a nearby hill, the city resembles a quilt repaired with fabrics gathered from many different generations, whole sections stitched beside places where careful hands have only begun measuring the damage. The people moving through these streets carry themselves differently than they did during the height of the Blitz. The instinct to glance upward at every unfamiliar engine has begun fading, though it has not disappeared entirely. Instead, their attention settles closer to the ground. They notice cracked pavements before distant skies, unstable walls before clouds, rebuilding notices before air raid instructions. Their fears have shortened their horizon. Safety is no longer measured by what approaches overhead but by whether tomorrow's walk to the baker, the tram stop, or the local school can be completed without encountering another unexpected obstacle left behind by yesterday's destruction. So the first stage of recovery unfolds not through celebration, nor through sweeping acts of reconstruction, but through thousands of restrained decisions made almost without witness. A family salvages one cupboard. A laborer clears another wheelbarrow of brick. An engineer marks a wall safe for entry. A neighbor carries tea across the street to someone sorting through the remains of a kitchen. Individually, each act seems too modest to deserve a place in history. Together, they begin forming the quiet foundation upon which an entire city will slowly learn that surviving the bombing and living after it are not the same condition at all. Streets that remembered their way. The city changes almost imperceptibly at first. Days become weeks, and weeks begin folding quietly into one another until even those who have lived through every stage struggle to remember precisely when certain habits returned. The rubble remains. Entire terraces still stand broken beneath changing skies. Yet somewhere between one morning and the next, people stop describing every journey by the damage they must avoid and begin speaking once more about where they are actually going. The destination gradually reclaims importance from the obstacle. You notice this change not through speeches or official announcements but through footsteps. The cautious pace of the earliest weeks slowly acquires confidence. Familiar routes emerge across neighborhoods where the original streets have been interrupted. Narrow footpaths worn through vacant lots become accepted shortcuts. Temporary wooden walkways laid across unstable ground remain in place so long that children assume they have always belonged there. People no longer pause to consider which way to travel each morning. Their bodies remember the altered geography before their minds consciously think about it. Market days reveal this quiet adjustment with particular clarity. Before dawn, traders arrive carrying crates of vegetables, sacks of potatoes, baskets of apples, smoked fish wrapped in paper, and whatever produce has managed to reach the city despite continuing shortages. Stalls appear along streets where buildings once stood, making practical use of open ground that destruction has unexpectedly provided. Customers queue patiently, exchanging familiar greetings while carefully stepping around stacks of reclaimed bricks waiting for collection later in the day. Commerce unfolds beside ruin without attempting to disguise either one. Buying bread and discussing damaged roofs become parts of the same ordinary conversation. Many shops reopen long before they can truly be called repaired. Broken display windows are replaced with timber panels painted neatly enough to suggest permanence, though everyone understands they are temporary. Customers enter through side doors because the original entrances remain unsafe. Shelves are fewer than before, their stock limited by rationing and disrupted supply lines. Yet shopkeepers arrange every available item with the same attention they once devoted to fully stocked premises. A clean counter, carefully folded wrapping paper, and polite conversation restore a surprising measure of dignity to rooms still carrying the scent of fresh plaster and damp brick. The routines surrounding food remain among the strongest anchors of civilian life. Housewives continue studying ration books with practiced concentration, calculating how best to stretch ingredients that never quite seem sufficient. Queues form outside butchers, bakers, and grocers, though they have acquired a different atmosphere from those of the hardest wartime months. Conversation drifts more easily now. People compare repairs taking place in neighboring streets, exchange recommendations for builders willing to replace damaged roofs, or quietly mention relatives who have finally returned after months spent elsewhere. News still travels by word of mouth as much as through newspapers, carried patiently from one waiting customer to the next. Children, perhaps more readily than adults, begin reclaiming spaces transformed by bombing. Empty lots where houses once stood become places of cautious adventure despite repeated warnings from parents and local authorities. Games adapt themselves to altered surroundings. Boundaries are marked not by garden fences that have disappeared, but by surviving walls or piles of bricks too heavy to move. The adults watching nearby experience conflicting emotions difficult to separate. Relief that children can once again laugh outdoors mingles with unease that their playgrounds exist only because entire streets have vanished. Neither feeling fully replaces the other. Schools also discover their own version of adaptation. Some classrooms return to buildings that escaped the worst damage, while others occupy church halls, community centers, or temporary structures erected with remarkable practicality. Teachers learn to conduct lessons beneath patched ceilings or inside rooms where replacement windows still differ noticeably from the originals. Exercise books are opened upon desks that may have been borrowed from another district altogether. Education resumes not because conditions have become ideal, but because waiting for perfection would postpone an entire generation. You watch pupils arriving each morning carrying satchels worn smooth through years of use. Their conversations sound reassuringly ordinary. They discuss arithmetic, football, favorite stories, difficult teachers, and whose turn it is to bring extra firewood for the classroom stove during colder months. Yet their routes to school quietly reveal how thoroughly the city has changed. One child crosses a temporary footbridge spanning ground where a row of houses once stood. Another walks beside fenced bomb sites that have become so familiar they scarcely attract notice anymore. The extraordinary has slowly dissolved into the ordinary, not because anyone has forgotten, but because memory has learned to coexist with routine. Public transport follows a similar pattern of gradual adjustment. Buses resume routes that remain possible while day touring around streets still blocked by reconstruction. Conductors answer the same questions each morning from passengers uncertain whether familiar stops have reopened. Trams move carefully through districts where tracks have only recently been repaired, their wheels producing reassuring sounds that many residents had come to associate with continuity long before the war. Waiting at a stop once again becomes an unremarkable part of daily life, though the shelter beside it may consist of temporary timber replacing structures lost months earlier. The city no longer feels suspended between one bombing and the next. Instead, it begins living within a different kind of uncertainty, one measured less by immediate danger than by patience. No one expects complete restoration next week or even next year. Roofs will remain patched through another winter. Vacant plots will continue gathering rainwater. Streets will stay uneven beneath careful footsteps. Yet alongside these acknowledgments grows something quieter and perhaps more enduring than optimism. It is the acceptance that ordinary life need not wait until everything has been repaired. It can return slowly, imperfectly, carrying its familiar rhythms across a landscape that still bears every visible mark of what has happened. As summer gradually gives way to autumn, the city begins measuring time less by the dates of famous raids and more by quieter seasonal concerns. Shopkeepers wonder whether repaired roofs will withstand the coming rains. Families inspect windows before colder winds arrive, stuffing strips of cloth into narrow gaps where replacement frames have not yet fitted properly. Coal deliveries become topics of careful discussion once again, not because winter is unusual, but because every damaged chimney, every patched fireplace, and every partially repaired home introduces new uncertainties into routines that had once seemed entirely predictable. The calendar slowly reclaims authority from the bombing, though the bombing continues shaping how each season is experienced. You notice the changing weather revealing differences that sunshine had concealed. Rain gathers in shallow depressions where cellars once lay beneath demolished houses. Grass begins appearing unexpectedly across vacant plots, softening sharp edges of brick and stone without disguising them. Moss settles quietly along broken walls left standing until reconstruction can eventually reach them. Nature does not repair the city, but it gently occupies every pause left by human rebuilding, reminding observers that landscapes rarely remain empty for long. Laundry once again hangs between surviving houses whenever the weather permits. Sheets move slowly in the breeze above streets still carrying scars of destruction, their clean white fabric contrasting with soot-darkened brickwork that has resisted every attempt at scrubbing. Women pause occasionally to adjust the lines, exchanging brief conversations across narrow alleys about children returning from school, ration coupons, relatives writing from distant towns, or rumors that another builder has finally agreed to repair a neighboring roof before winter. Domestic life does not ignore the surrounding damage. It simply continues unfolding within it, quietly insisting that washing clothes, preparing meals, and tending gardens remain necessary even when history has altered every familiar backdrop. Gardens become particularly revealing places during these months. Some remain untouched, their flowers returning with surprising determination despite shattered fences and cracked garden walls. Others have become temporary storage spaces for bricks salvaged from nearby buildings, stacks of timber waiting to be reused, or tools shared among several neighboring households attempting modest repairs themselves. Vegetable patches grow beside collapsed outbuildings, and climbing beans wind patiently around supports leaning slightly from blast damage sustained months before. These small cultivated spaces reveal how recovery often begins not with large public projects but with individuals restoring manageable corners of the world immediately surrounding them. Children continue adapting more quickly than the adults observing them. They invent games whose rules quietly acknowledge the changed landscape without dwelling upon it. A bomb site becomes a boundary rather than a spectacle. A surviving wall marks the edge of an imaginary football pitch. Pieces of smooth brick collected from cleared rubble are traded with the same enthusiasm earlier generations might have reserved for marbles or polished stones gathered beside streams. Parents occasionally call them away from places still considered unsafe, their voices carrying equal measures of caution and resignation. They understand that an entire childhood cannot be postponed until every damaged building has disappeared. Inside homes that remain habitable, ordinary evenings slowly recover familiar patterns. Kettles whistle softly upon repaired stoves. Wireless radios bring music, news, and comedy into sitting rooms where ceilings may still bear fine cracks from distant explosions. Families gather around modest suppers prepared from rationed ingredients, discussing school assignments, workplace routines, neighborhood gossip, and practical concerns about repairs awaiting materials that remain difficult to obtain. Conversations occasionally pause when someone remembers an absent relative or glances toward a photograph rescued from a damaged house months earlier, but those silences no longer dominate the evening. They settle naturally into lives that have learned to carry memory without allowing it to interrupt every ordinary moment. Public houses, cafes, and small tea rooms also resume their quiet social purpose. Their walls may display fresh plaster beside older brickwork darkened by smoke, and their furniture often consists of whatever could be gathered after damaged premises reopened, yet the conversations unfolding inside feel increasingly familiar. Men finishing shifts discuss wages, building contracts, football results, and the latest municipal notices concerning reconstruction. Women meet friends over tea while comparing prices, exchanging recipes that make the most of limited ingredients, or offering advice about where replacement furniture might still be found. These conversations rarely dwell upon the bombing itself. Instead, they revolve around the countless practical adjustments through which recovery gradually expresses itself. You observe another subtle transformation taking place almost unnoticed. People begin referring to damaged places with established names rather than temporary descriptions. What had once been spoken of as the house that was hit becomes simply Mrs. Turner's place. A vacant corner known immediately after the raids as the bomb site gradually acquires another identity linked to the children who play nearby or the market stall that now occupies one edge. Language itself begins repairing continuity. The city slowly restores familiar ways of speaking, even while the physical landscape continues carrying unmistakable evidence of interruption. This change does not mean forgetting. On certain evenings, when low clouds drift across the rooftops and distant aircraft pass overhead on peaceful journeys entirely unrelated to war, conversations may pause almost imperceptibly. Some heads still lift toward the sky before habit gently reminds them that these sounds belong to another time. The instinct fades slowly, not because memory weakens, but because repetition gradually teaches the nervous system that silence can once again remain silence, and that the steady hum of an engine no longer demands immediate calculation of distance, direction, or danger. By the close of the first full year without sustained bombing, many neighborhoods possess a curious dual identity. They are undeniably wounded, their missing buildings visible from nearly every street, their shortages continuing to shape daily decisions. Yet they are also unmistakably alive. Bakers know their regular customers again. School bells ring according to dependable schedules. Bus conductors recognize familiar passengers. Garden gates open each morning for workers leaving home, and close each evening behind families returning for supper. The city has not recovered in the sense that newspapers might someday declare complete. It has achieved something quieter and perhaps more remarkable. It has rediscovered the patient rhythm of ordinary days, proving that routine itself can become one of the strongest foundations upon which a broken society begins to stand again. The quiet machinery of repair. The work of rebuilding becomes easier to overlook precisely because it grows more organized. During the first months after the bombing, recovery had been visible everywhere through scattered acts of persistence. A family cleared a single room. Neighbors shared tools across a damaged street. Volunteers removed loose bricks before children passed on their way to school. These efforts remained deeply personal, tied to individual households and immediate necessity. As time continues its measured passage, however, another presence becomes increasingly apparent. Institutions, often invisible when functioning well, begin quietly shaping the landscape with their own rhythms of patience and procedure. You notice the change first through paper rather than stone. Notices appear on municipal boards outside council offices, pinned carefully beneath glass despite the weather. Typed announcements replace hastily handwritten messages left during the emergency months. Lists of scheduled repairs, temporary housing arrangements, utility restorations, road closures, and construction priorities accumulate week after week. Few residents linger to read every detail, yet nearly everyone pauses long enough to search for the particular information affecting their own street. Recovery has entered a stage where decisions are no longer made entirely at the edge of the rubble. Increasingly, they begin in offices where maps cover walls and files steadily fill wooden cabinets. Inside those offices, the atmosphere differs markedly from the damaged neighborhoods beyond the windows, though both remain connected by the same purpose. Clerks lean over large plans showing districts divided into careful grids, marking completed inspections with colored pencils whose points gradually shorten through constant use. Engineers compare measurements gathered from buildings that outwardly appear similar yet conceal vastly different structural conditions. Surveyors spread photographs across long tables, tracing cracks in foundations and noting where entire rows of houses may require demolition rather than repair. Much of this work produces no immediate transformation outside. Entire weeks may pass while paperwork quietly determines what future streets will eventually become. The decisions themselves rarely satisfy everyone. Materials remain limited despite the end of sustained bombing. Skilled labor cannot be summoned simply because it is urgently needed. Bricks must be manufactured, transported, sorted, and distributed according to priorities that often appear frustratingly slow to families waiting for permanent homes. Timber competes with countless other demands placed upon national resources. Glass, steel, roofing materials, plumbing supplies, electrical wiring. Each possesses its own complicated journey before finally arriving at the building site where someone has been waiting patiently for months. Waiting, therefore, changes character once again. It is no longer the anxious waiting of air raid shelters, nor the cautious waiting outside unstable buildings during the earliest days after destruction. This new waiting belongs to lists, schedules, approvals, deliveries, inspections, and budgets. Letters arrive informing households that assessments have been completed, only to explain that construction cannot yet begin. Another letter follows several weeks later requesting additional information before compensation may proceed. Each envelope carries progress measured not in visible bricks laid upon walls but in administrative steps that slowly guide recovery forward. You observe these bureaucratic rhythms reflected even in ordinary conversations. At the butcher's queue, people discuss survey dates rather than bombing raids. Neighbors compare experiences with housing officers instead of air raid wardens. Someone mentions that plumbing repairs have finally been approved, while another quietly admits they remain several positions farther down the waiting list. These exchanges lack the urgency that often attracts historical attention, yet they reveal another form of endurance altogether. The war has ended overhead. It continues, in quieter form, across desks where scarce resources must somehow answer overwhelming need. The men and women working within these institutions rarely consider themselves central figures in recovery. Many begin each morning by hanging damp coats beside crowded office doors before settling behind desks already covered with correspondence awaiting replies. Their work unfolds through measurements, signatures, calculations, inventories, telephone conversations, inspection reports, and endless revisions as circumstances continue changing. A bridge thought safe last month requires additional reinforcement after fresh examinations. A housing project planned for one district must shift elsewhere because newly discovered damage proves more extensive than first believed. Every adjustment sends quiet ripples through dozens of other plans. Outside, reconstruction crews continue their patient labor, though the work now follows increasingly deliberate patterns. Streets are no longer cleared simply because they are blocked. They are prioritized according to transportation needs, utility access, population density, and structural feasibility. Builders arrive carrying detailed drawings rather than relying solely upon practical judgment formed at the site itself. Temporary repairs gradually give way to more permanent solutions, though many temporary structures remain standing far longer than anyone originally expected. The city learns that provisional arrangements possess an unexpected talent for becoming familiar. One morning, you stand beside a section of road where workers have spent several days replacing underground water pipes damaged during earlier raids. Little of their effort remains visible from the surface. The pavement is reopened, carts resume passing overhead, pedestrians continue without interruption, and within days only those directly involved remember precisely what took place beneath their feet. Such invisible achievements become increasingly characteristic of institutional recovery. Success often announces itself through the absence of difficulty rather than dramatic transformation. Clean water reaches kitchens. Electricity flows reliably through repaired cables. Trains arrive according to timetables that gradually recover their former consistency. The city begins functioning more smoothly long before it begins looking fully restored. The physical landscape reflects this gradual coordination. Stacks of salvaged brick appear arranged with greater order than during the earliest months. Timber yards expand near railway sidings where deliveries can be distributed efficiently across several districts. Workshops reopen to repair doors, windows, iron railings, and furniture rather than replacing everything entirely. Materials circulate through networks becoming more refined with experience. Recovery increasingly resembles an intricate conversation between thousands of workers who may never meet one another yet remain connected through shared purpose. From a distance, the progress seems frustratingly slow. Entire neighborhoods continue displaying obvious wounds. Vacant plots interrupt familiar streets. Temporary fencing surrounds buildings awaiting decisions, still trapped somewhere within administrative processes. Yet beneath this apparent stillness, an enormous machinery of planning has begun turning with quiet determination. It moves without spectacle, rarely attracting headlines or commemorative photographs, but it steadily reshapes the conditions under which civilian life can continue. The city is no longer surviving one damaged day after another. It is gradually learning how to rebuild itself through systems as patient and methodical as the people they are intended to serve. As reconstruction settles into longer rhythms, the work begins extending beyond the buildings most visibly damaged by the bombing. Recovery increasingly depends upon systems that most residents rarely notice until they cease functioning. Beneath familiar streets, engineers continue tracing water mains fractured by explosions months or even years earlier. Electricians inspect substations where temporary repairs have quietly carried neighborhoods through successive winters. Railway workers walk long stretches of track before dawn, searching for subtle weaknesses in bridges, retaining walls, and embankments that wartime strain may have concealed beneath apparently reliable surfaces. The city discovers that restoring ordinary life requires attention not only to what can be seen above ground, but also to the intricate network supporting it from below. You observe these efforts during the early hours, when streets remain comparatively empty and the sounds of industry travel farther through the cool morning air. Small groups of workers arrive carrying toolboxes polished smooth through constant handling, surveying instruments packed carefully into wooden cases, coils of cable resting across broad shoulders, and folded plans protected beneath oilskin covers against uncertain weather. There is little conversation beyond practical instruction. Most have repeated similar routines hundreds of times already. Their confidence comes not from dramatic achievement but from familiarity earned through patient repetition. The rhythm of paperwork continues matching the rhythm of physical labor. Each completed inspection generates another report. Every repaired bridge requires certification before traffic may fully resume. Deliveries are checked against inventories compiled weeks earlier, while shortages identified today influence procurement decisions affecting projects months into the future. Files accumulate steadily inside municipal offices, their growing weight reflecting thousands of individual decisions that remain invisible to almost everyone outside the administrative process. The rebuilding of a city proves to be as much an exercise in documentation as in construction. Housing gradually becomes one of the defining concerns shaping everyday conversation. Emergency accommodation has served many families through the immediate aftermath, but temporary arrangements carry their own quiet burdens. Several generations may share rooms originally intended for one household. Privacy becomes increasingly difficult to preserve as months lengthen into years. Kitchens designed for modest use now support several families preparing meals according to different schedules, while children complete schoolwork wherever a small corner of table space becomes available. These accommodations demonstrate remarkable resilience, yet everyone understands they were never meant to become permanent. Local housing officers spend much of their working lives balancing requests that possess equal legitimacy but insufficient available homes. One family has lost everything to bombing. Another occupies a building now judged structurally unsafe. Elderly residents struggle with damaged staircases that younger tenants manage more easily. Parents seek larger accommodation as children grow older within overcrowded rooms. Every application arrives carrying its own story of endurance, and every decision inevitably postpones someone else's relief. The correspondence remains courteous, the procedures carefully documented, yet beneath each file lies the quiet recognition that rebuilding a city's housing stock cannot proceed as quickly as human need demands. Construction sites themselves acquire a noticeably different atmosphere from those of the earliest recovery period. Initial clearance gave way to measured planning, and planning now yields increasingly deliberate creation. Foundations are excavated with greater precision than emergency work ever allowed. Bricklayers establish long, unbroken courses of new masonry where piles of reclaimed materials once stood waiting for uncertain purpose. Carpenters raise roof timbers whose clean lines contrast gently with older buildings blackened by years of smoke and weather. None of these activities suggest haste. They belong instead to craftsmanship conscious that what is built today may stand for generations yet unborn. You watch apprentices working beside older tradesmen whose experience stretches back well before the war. The younger workers learn not only technical skills but quieter habits rarely written into manuals. They discover how to judge the quality of reclaimed brick by sound when lightly tapped together, how to recognize seasoned timber suitable for reuse, and how older foundations sometimes reveal forgotten methods of construction requiring thoughtful adaptation rather than replacement. The rebuilding of the city becomes, almost unexpectedly, an exchange between generations. Knowledge interrupted by war begins flowing once again through ordinary labor. Meanwhile, municipal planners gradually confront questions extending beyond simple restoration. Certain streets damaged beyond practical repair invite reconsideration rather than exact reconstruction. Improved drainage, wider roads, updated utilities, additional green spaces, and revised building standards quietly enter conversations once dominated solely by replacing what has been lost. These discussions rarely unfold dramatically. They emerge through committee meetings, engineering reports, and modest adjustments to drawings spread across drafting tables. Yet they reveal another transformation taking place beneath the surface of recovery. The city is no longer asking only how to rebuild. Increasingly, it asks how to prepare for decades still to come. The residents encounter these institutional changes gradually, often through modest inconveniences that later prove quietly significant. A familiar road remains closed several weeks longer than expected while deeper utility work continues beneath the surface. Bus routes shift temporarily to accommodate bridge repairs whose necessity is not immediately obvious. Street lighting disappears for several evenings while electrical systems undergo replacement, only to return with greater reliability afterward. Few people witness the full extent of the labor creating these improvements. They simply notice, over time, that ordinary life begins demanding slightly less effort than before. By now the city possesses two distinct tempos existing side by side. One belongs to civilian routine, the morning queues, school lessons, shop deliveries, evening meals, and familiar conversations gradually restored after years of disruption. The other belongs to institutional patience, moving according to contracts, engineering schedules, budget allocations, material deliveries, and carefully sequenced construction projects whose completion may remain years away. Neither tempo dominates the other. Instead, they slowly intertwine until it becomes difficult to imagine daily life without the steady background presence of reconstruction quietly continuing beyond the next street corner. The rebuilding visible above ground often receives the greatest admiration, yet perhaps the deeper achievement lies elsewhere. It resides within the countless ordinary systems that gradually recover their quiet reliability, allowing residents to stop thinking about them altogether. Water flows when taps are opened. Trains arrive often enough to become predictable once more. Street lamps illuminate familiar routes home after dark. Schools remain warm through winter mornings. Refuse is collected, letters are delivered, markets are supplied, and neighborhoods slowly regain the unnoticed rhythms upon which peaceful societies have always depended. These modest certainties accumulate until they form something larger than infrastructure alone. They become the patient architecture of confidence, teaching a wounded city that stability, like recovery itself, is usually built one unremarkable day at a time. Seasons over changed ground. Years continue passing with a quiet confidence that would once have seemed almost unimaginable. The rebuilding never truly reaches a moment when someone can honestly declare the work complete. Instead, it gradually becomes difficult to distinguish where recovery ends and ordinary civic life begins. A scaffold appears around one building while another, restored years earlier, already requires routine maintenance unrelated to the war. Fresh coats of paint brighten shop fronts that had once stood behind timber boarding. New families move into houses without ever knowing the names of those who occupied the same ground before the bombing. Time performs its patient work without ceremony, gently shifting extraordinary history into the background of everyday existence. You notice this most clearly in the smallest routines. A postman walks the same route each morning, his satchel growing lighter with every letter delivered through polished front doors. He pauses only briefly at each gate, moving with the confidence that comes from years of repetition rather than conscious thought. Many of the addresses on his round no longer match the buildings that once stood there, yet the rhythm of delivery has become dependable again. Letters now carry invitations, bills, birthday cards, employment notices, school reports, and ordinary family correspondence far more often than news of evacuation, casualty, or uncertainty. The purpose of the journey remains unchanged, but the emotional weight of its contents has quietly transformed. Markets also lose their temporary character. Stalls that once stood among piles of cleared brick now occupy established positions known to regular customers. Familiar traders greet children who have grown noticeably taller since first accompanying their parents to buy vegetables after the bombing ceased. Seasonal produce returns according to dependable agricultural rhythms rather than the unpredictable disruptions of wartime transport. Spring asparagus gives way to summer berries, autumn apples, winter root vegetables, each appearing with reassuring regularity. These small certainties accumulate until they become almost invisible, though they represent achievements no less significant than the rebuilding of bridges or railway stations. The city itself begins acquiring new memories layered gently upon the older ones. A couple marries in a church painstakingly restored after sustaining bomb damage years earlier. Their wedding photographs capture sunlight falling across fresh stonework that future generations will simply assume has always existed. Children born after the war climb trees planted where shattered buildings once stood, their games creating laughter in places previously associated with smoke and falling masonry. Office workers hurry across squares rebuilt with careful attention to practical design, scarcely aware that the route beneath their feet followed a different course before destruction altered the neighborhood. History continues flowing forward, carrying older memories without remaining entirely governed by them. For those who lived through the bombing, however, certain moments retain an almost imperceptible power to reopen earlier recollections. The unexpected smell of damp plaster after heavy rain may briefly recall the weeks spent repairing damaged rooms. A distant engine crossing low cloud can awaken habits that reason gently assures are no longer necessary. The sharp ringing of church bells on a clear winter evening may summon memories of services held among broken walls when entire congregations gathered beneath temporary roofs. These recollections seldom interrupt daily life for long. They pass through the mind like familiar visitors, acknowledged quietly before continuing on their way. You watch older neighbors sharing such memories less frequently as time advances, not because they have become less important, but because they have grown more deeply integrated into personal identity. Stories once told in careful chronological detail gradually shorten into brief observations offered while tending gardens, waiting for buses, or watching grandchildren play. Someone points toward a row of houses and simply remarks that nothing stood there for years. Another remembers the bakery that occupied a corner now replaced by a small park. These comments require little explanation among those who understand them. They belong to a generation carrying invisible maps that coexist peacefully with the visible city surrounding them. The physical landscape also preserves its own understated archive. Certain walls still display subtle differences in brick color where repairs joined older construction. Some streets remain slightly wider because planners seized opportunities presented by wartime destruction to improve traffic flow. Mature trees planted during reconstruction now cast generous shade over pavements that once lay fully exposed beneath empty skies. Public buildings erected after the war gradually acquire their own weathering, their stones softening beneath decades of rain until they seem almost indistinguishable from structures standing much longer. Even renewal eventually becomes part of history. As evening settles once more across the city, lights appear in windows stretching far beyond the districts most heavily affected by bombing. Their warm glow forms an uninterrupted pattern that would have seemed almost impossible during those uncertain months immediately after the raids ended. Somewhere, a wireless plays quietly behind drawn curtains. Elsewhere, someone washes dishes after supper while another prepares tomorrow's lunch before bed. A train crosses a bridge repaired so carefully that most passengers never think about the work supporting their journey. The ordinary has reclaimed its place not by erasing the past, but by patiently growing around it until both can exist together without contradiction. Looking across these neighborhoods now, it becomes clear that recovery was never a destination waiting at the end of a single road. It was a manner of walking. It lived within countless restrained decisions repeated day after day, sweeping dust from familiar doorsteps, reopening classrooms before every window had been replaced, repairing water pipes beneath streets that still bore visible scars, planting flowers beside walls awaiting reconstruction, raising children who learned to distinguish peace not through speeches or ceremonies but through the dependable return of ordinary mornings. None of these acts alone rebuilt a city. Together, they quietly restored something even more delicate than brick or stone. They restored the confidence that tomorrow could resemble today for reasons other than survival. The bombing had transformed streets, homes, institutions, and lives in ways no amount of rebuilding could entirely reverse. Yet the years that followed revealed another truth just as enduring. Human communities possess an extraordinary capacity to absorb loss without surrendering the habits that make ordinary life worth protecting. The rebuilt walls, the repaired railways, the reopened markets, and the familiar evening lights all became expressions of that quiet resilience. Not triumphant, not dramatic, but steady enough to carry one generation safely into the care of the next. The streets are quieter now than they have been at any point in our journey. Evening settles across the rooftops with the same unhurried certainty that greeted us at the beginning. Yet the city no longer feels suspended between uncertainty and recovery. The spaces that once drew the eye because they were broken have become part of a wider landscape whose rhythm is no longer defined by absence alone. Trees sway above pavements where countless footsteps have gradually worn new paths into familiar stone. Window lights appear one after another as dusk deepens, each one belonging to a household living an ordinary evening that previous generations struggled patiently to make possible. You stand for a final moment beside a street that has witnessed every stage of this quiet transformation. It remembers the nights when sirens scattered families toward shelters beneath the ground. It remembers the mornings when smoke drifted slowly upward from buildings no longer capable of sheltering anyone. It remembers the long seasons of clearing brick after brick, repairing pipes hidden beneath broken roads, replacing windows before replacing roofs, and teaching children to walk safely through neighborhoods whose geography had been rewritten almost overnight. None of those memories have disappeared. They have simply settled deeper into the foundations, becoming part of the character of the place rather than its constant occupation. History often prefers moments of decision. It remembers declarations, victories, dramatic photographs, and days that can be marked neatly upon calendars. Yet most lives are shaped less by singular moments than by what follows them. The bombing demanded courage measured in minutes and hours. Recovery demanded courage measured in months, years, and eventually decades. It asked people to continue long after newspapers had shifted their attention elsewhere. It required patience strong enough to survive paperwork, shortages, unfinished streets, postponed repairs, and the slow realization that rebuilding a city meant rebuilding habits before buildings, confidence before comfort, and ordinary routine before any sense of completion. The people who lived through those years rarely thought of themselves as participants in an extraordinary historical chapter while they were living it. A woman sweeping dust from her doorstep before opening her shop, a railway engineer checking bolts beneath a bridge before the first morning train, a teacher arranging borrowed desks inside a temporary classroom, or a council clerk carefully reviewing another housing application each believed they were simply doing what the day required. Yet together they formed something far larger than any individual effort. Their routines became the unseen architecture supporting the visible recovery that later generations would admire. As time moved onward, new lives naturally filled the spaces left by older ones. Children became parents. Apprentices became master builders. Saplings planted beside reconstructed streets grew into broad trees whose branches eventually shaded people with no memory of why they had first been planted there. The city never returned to precisely what it had been before the Blitz, because no city truly returns unchanged after enduring such a passage. Instead, it became something quieter and perhaps more enduring, a place that carried its wounds honestly while allowing life to continue unfolding around them. If you were to walk those neighborhoods today, you would find reminders only if you knew where to look. A plaque fixed discreetly to a wall. A church rebuilt with stones subtly lighter than the originals. An unexpected open space between older terraces. A row of houses whose proportions reveal the careful thinking of post-war architects rather than Victorian builders. Most people pass these details without noticing them, and perhaps that, too, is part of recovery. Memory need not announce itself constantly in order to remain present. Sometimes it survives most faithfully by becoming woven into the ordinary fabric of daily life. The wind moves gently through leaves that now stand where smoke once drifted. Rain falls upon roofs rebuilt by careful hands many decades ago. Trains cross bridges strengthened so thoroughly that their passengers rarely think about the work hidden beneath the tracks. Children laugh in parks created from land that once seemed beyond repair. Evening birds settle onto chimneys whose bricks were laid by people determined that warmth would one day return to those homes. The landscape continues carrying countless quiet conversations between past and present, each season adding another layer without erasing those that came before. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson left by the cities that endured the Blitz. Recovery was never the moment when every damaged wall had been repaired or every missing building replaced. It was the gradual return of trust in ordinary tomorrow. It was the confidence to plant a tree whose full shade you might never personally enjoy. It was the decision to build a classroom for children not yet born, to repair a railway for journeys still waiting to be taken, or to restore a neighborhood because communities deserve futures even after history has asked impossible things of them. The night settles completely now. Windows glow softly behind curtains, footsteps fade along familiar pavements, and the city breathes with the quiet confidence of a place that has learned not to forget, but also not to remain imprisoned by memory. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, the stars emerge one by one, indifferent to the years that have passed below them, while the wind carries no sirens, no falling bombs, and no urgent warning, only the gentle sounds of ordinary life continuing, exactly as so many hoped it one day would. You've been part of Echoes of War, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.